In this video series, I'm going to compare real-world fighter pilot interfaces with those of science fiction, and talk about how I'd like to see this represented in Star Citizen. At the time of recording, Star Citizen is in alpha, so I'm using what information we have against a backdrop of my own knowledge on modern combat aviation. I've made every effort to use the correct terminology, but if I do make a mistake on the details, it shouldn't affect the overall theme that I'm discussing. This is all guesswork, however, so we'll have a brief look at the interfaces themselves, using some modern fighter sims such as DCS-A10C and Falcon BMS. We'll also use some examples from Diaspora and Elite Dangerous for comparison. Footage of Star Citizen comes from their Arena Commander PAX East and Beyond video, which you can find in the description or click the link in the video. My hopes for this series is to not only imagine how combat in space would evolve from current fighter technology, but to teach people unfamiliar with all this, and if at all possible, give ideas for implementation, however big or small it may be. But now that that's out of the way, let's get on to part 1. In part 1, we will compare real-world aircraft sims to that of the Hornet in Star Citizen. After seeing the DogFight teasers, I realised that there is a lot of information on screen that isn't centralised the way you'd expect it. I tried to use my experience in what fighter pilots today have to use, and extrapolate that into what fighter pilots in a fictional space fighter would have. Information is key. Knowing all you need to know at a quick glance, not only for yourself, but for friendlies and enemies, is the best tool you have. This happens through your heads-up display, or head-mounted display, of which we have both existing today. What you don't want to do is put information that is extraneous or irrelevant to what's happening, and with the advancement of technology today, we are already seeing an incredible amount of switches and dials removed to simplify everything. To what end in the far future is unknown, but we can only guess. However, we can be sure some things will always be important. Nothing I say is an absolute, but questions it, and I understand many will think, who f***ing cares? But as a person who spends way too much time in flight sims, it's something I do care about. But I'm not completely oblivious to the fact that not everybody will agree with me, and that Star Citizen will unlikely have the fidelity a single aircraft module like DCS will have, for example. I don't expect a 5 to 10 minute startup and have 100 buttons to click, but I do hope for them to get the most critical things right, and not for the sake of making it approachable to everyone. Just like you have people who cannot fly fixed wing or rotary in battlefields, for example, it's simply a matter of practice and learning, and if you simply cannot do it, try harder. It might sound elitist, but we all have someone better at something than us, or have things we cannot do. After all, this is a space sim. Now, to move things on, we'll hop on Falcon BMS to cover the very basics of what we see in our HUD, then jump in some DCS-A10C to see the similarities, and finally Diaspora Shattered Armistice and Elite Dangerous to see some recent and upcoming takes on space sims. This is Falcon 4.0 with the 3 updates from benchmark sims who've done an absolutely incredible job of keeping a 15-year-old game trucking along. Next to DCS, it's the go-to sim for modern fighters, specifically F-16s. Jumping right into flight, let's talk about the HUD and HMD. Right now we're in nav mode, or navigation mode. This presents us with all the information we need for just flying about without combat. It's not exciting, I know, but to compare it to Star Citizen, I want to start here before combat in part 2, and I don't aim to make this a long tutorial, but rather an informative video. Starting with the HUD. Everything is eyes forward and not in our peripheral vision. If I need to look around the cockpit and not at the HUD, I'm presented with a head-mounted display, which is similar to one of that of the HUD. This allows me to look around and still know the information shown at fixed locations, essential for when you need to keep eyes on a bogey on your 6. If we take a quick look at Diaspora, you can see that it looks fairly similar. But for what it isn't a hardcore sim. We'll have a smaller look at this later. DCS-A10 has a much more similar HUD, except for the lack of HMD. We will again be having a short look at this later. Lastly, Elite. It looks more like Diaspora again, as it follows many space sims, something I think should be improved upon, especially for multiplayer. Let's talk a bit more about HUD elements in BMS. As briefly as I can, we'll run through everything from top to bottom, left to right, so from here to here to here. Here we have the load factor, or G meter, telling you your current G-force. With no velocity change or direction change, we're sitting at a pretty 1 G. Fighter pilots today would expect to pull around 6 to 9 Gs of varying length, and in a max range pull short bursts of 10 to 12. Negative Gs are something we're worse at coping with around 3 G. Flight suit advancements have made higher Gs more enduring, knocking off about 2 Gs, meaning 10 feels like 8, a whole world of difference. Next, we have our airspeed indicator showing the current speed in knots, with the speed tape that moves up and down depending on changes in velocity. In space sims, this is usually changed to meters a second. Next, here, where it says ARM, that simply means master arm for weapons is turned on. Moving down, we have our max speed indicator, which won't play part in non-atmospheric flight, so we'll skip this. Next, where it says nav here, it basically means we're in navigation mode, and it will change depending what master mode we're in, such as MRM mode or air-to-air mode. And then if I go here, I can go to dogfight mode, but we'll get into these a bit more in part 2 because it's more regarding combat. Then next, these two numbers here, it's simply the first one is the bearing to the bullseye, and then the range to the bullseye. And the bullseye is simply a mark on the map where all units in the area operation can reference from. But again, it's something more suited to part 2 and combat. Back to the top center, we have a fixed marker which is bore sighted to the guns. It's usually there as a backup and last resort for referencing where the guns will fire toward without a solution. And here we have our pitch ladder, which is pretty self-explanatory. So if I pitch up here, you can see I am 5 degrees pitched up, and if I pitch down, I am 5 degrees pitched down, and then the long horizontal line here is flying level. In the middle here is the flight path marker or velocity vector, which I've gone through in my first Diaspora video, but to explain it simply, we'll fly in the weeds here and visually demonstrate. Simply put, it's your aircraft with the wings looking from behind. It points forward to your direction of travel, and if we come close to a ridgeline, it will tell us if we're going to make over the top or smack straight into the hillside.
Altitude.
There's a limiting factor of how far you can see it, and we'll demonstrate it here in its use in space sims with multi-directional thrusters. As we can see here in Diaspora, it's pretty much identical. However, if we go stationary, so watch the FPV, up, and then thrusting down, bring it to a hole, and then I'll thrust left and right. It's pretty basic. Below this we have the heading or bearing indicator. It'll simply state the heading we are going in, made up of 360 degrees. We can see here we're on a heading of 270, which is direct west. Now, when you're flying alone it's all great. You don't really need to know your headings as importantly as then when you're playing with other people. It's nice to know where they are and when they're giving off references, or if you're giving off references to a target, that information is handy. So for example, if you were in a space sim, a contact could be directly west, but they're like 5 degrees up, 10 degrees up, or 90 degrees directly above me and coming straight down. In flight sims it's not much of an issue, but in space sims where you don't have to worry about the ground and gravity, contacts can be coming from literally any direction. Instead you'd give 2 bearings instead of a single plane. So say I'd have a contact in front of me at 45 degrees, I'd say contact 270 Mark 045. To better illustrate this, let's take what I've just said into this demonstration. So, we have our jet flying 270 or west. Now we rotate the image to add a second compass. Remember what I said? Contact 270 Mark 045. So the first bearing is lateral at 270 degrees, and the second bearing is longitudinal at 045. So we zoom out and we can easily see we have a contact directly in front of me and slightly above. Now, you're probably thinking, but Chris, there are no cardinal directions in space, or bearings to give references from. You're absolutely right. However, it wouldn't be far-fetched to assume that if real space combat existed, we'd have ship-to-ship tactical displays with the shared overlay of the area. I can demonstrate that here. In Diaspora we can see a fleet of ships in formation, and a tactical overlay placed. All ships would see this, and would see the same north heading in front of them in this particular instance. Then if we zoom in to an imaginary ship, and had him rotate in different directions, you'd see that all the bearings are fixed, so a pilot can reference targets to one another or have command and control operators on ships designate targets and act as a sort of AWACS. This is scaled simply for an example. These grids could be a kilometre or more across squared, each with a reference number for ease of navigation to the centre of it. You could have a contact at 5C for example, and all you'd have to do is input that grid coordinate and fly to it. It doesn't have to be exact because as you get closer your sensors take over. It's not asking for lengthy 9 lines. You type C5 into your navi and then it'll pop up on your HMD or HUD and then you'd fly to it. At the bottom is our bank angle, which is the angle your wings are banked at. But like a few other things, it's something I don't expect to see in the space sim. It's just not needed unless we have atmospheric flight. Finally, to the right side, we have our current altitude in feet via barometric pressure. Important for flight on a planet, useless in space. Maybe we'll go into that in our combat video. Next, we have our radar altimeter. Again, this is the altitude using a radar to the surface directly below the aircraft, which usually kicks in at lower level altitudes. It will be handy for near object maneuvers or landing on carriers and space sims so that you don't damage your landing gear, especially if it's a fast approach that you have little control over. Lastly, we have our bearing and distance indicators, which references a marker, waypoint or steer point selected, which we'll talk about next. It simply indicates the bearing to it and the distance from it. So we can see there is a lot of information in such a small space. For someone unfamiliar to this, it's just numbers and words which have no meaning, but they all have a purpose. Personally, there are 5 key pieces of information that keep me aware and away from crashing into terrain or obstacles. Speed, altitude, pitch, heading, and velocity vector. But we must not forget sensory inputs, which we'll also shortly get into. Everything I've just mentioned is something you'll see in navigation mode, or nav mode for short, a non-combat mode. The last thing which I'll show you are waypoint markers. Either given to you pre-planned before flight, or on the fly. If systems allow it, you'll have an overview of your start point, a route to follow, a final destination, and follow simple designations of, say, waypoint A, B, C, or 1, 2, 3, and you can rename them if you so wish. In DCSA 10 we have the Tactical Awareness Display, or TAD. This baby is my favourite awareness tool because it will show you a colour map of where you're flying with pre-planned routes and objects, as well as friendly ground and air positions. As well as that, the ability to highlight those in your specific flight, as well as share targets. In BMS we have the Horizontal Situation Display, or HSD, which is a decluttered version of this in a similar function. In Star Citizen, the only tactical display we seem to have is the DRADIS, direction, range and distance. That's the name from BSG, but it works the same. It shows the horizontal plane in orange and seems to remain level with the ship, while the faded blue circle appears to orient to the planet in a similar fashion to telling you it's the ground. You can think of it like a sphere emanating from your ship outwards and showing you your targets in a 3D view. Hopefully it can be zoomed in or out, and the size of the icons can be changed, decluttered or prioritized based on threat. But as we can see here, as he gains distance and flies backwards away from the ship, those rings in orange do expand, so it seems to have some sort of auto-scaling. As well as that, we have a really neat tool to quickly find where waypoints are in 3D space. Using our HMD, if I start looking around, I get this diamond with an X through it. When I come close to looking at the waypoint, the diamond starts moving and the X disappears. That means that's exactly where the marker is. It can be on the ground or in the air, it doesn't matter. This can be an amazing tool for navigation in space. There are great uses for waypoints, visually, especially when you're trying to thread the needle between 2 SAM sites, or I guess in space against automate defences, maybe navigating a narrow corridor in a neutral zone, or a secret pathway amongst large asteroids to stay hidden from scanners. Information of which could be useless, or worth in-game credits. In Diaspora, they use the actual DRADIS. Like Star Citizen, it's an expanding globe of tactical information, with a target highlighted, as well as showing as selected on your HMD. The downside of this particular one is that you cannot modify it at all. You can't zoom in, can't zoom out, can't declutter the friendlies, or anything. Not only that, it's just a bit too zoomed out, so you can't really work out exactly what it's targeting. As mentioned already, Star Citizen has a bigger version of this. Exactly how all the elements currently work together is unknown, but we can try have a closer look. There is an outer solid orange line and an inner dotted line. These seem to grow and shrink based on your target and its distance, scaling that so when you're close it magnifies, and when you're far away it takes a step back to see the larger battlefield. Hopefully we can modify this, expand it, have it prioritize modes, and to filter enemies and such. In BMS, you have a radar warning receiver, or RWR. Its job is to find, identify and display friendly and enemy aircraft near you, usually within 40 miles or so, the outer being further away and less important, and the inner circle being threats within their engagement range to you. Secondly, warn of incoming radar logs, either by a specific aircraft or a missile itself, but only if there's a radar log that's considered a hard log or active missile log, which only gives a warning when the missile has locked on itself rather from the aircraft it's fired from, often too late for you to react. Moving on to our next topic, sensory feedback. This can be visually through on-screen prompts, by touch via force feedback if you have it, and orally via audible indicators. Audible warnings can be anything from altitude,
Altitude. Altitude.
pull up,
Pull up. Pull up. Pull up.
stall or speed warnings, radar tracking warnings, friendlies locking onto you or buddy spike, missile launch warnings, fuel warnings such as
Bingo. Bingo.
which means you're almost out of fuel and it's time to go home, countermeasure dispensing systems such as chaff and flare.
Chaff flare. Chaff flare.
Then you hear the engines. Just like driving a car, it might not seem like much, but by sound alone we know when to shift gears. In BMS there are a few telltale signs on it if you're at idle, reduced, max thrust or afterburner. It's also important to distinguish between max thrust and afterburning, the former being buster, which is full military power, and the latter being sprinting, which is afterburners. At idle we have high-pitched whine from the turbines. We start to power up to about 50% and that whine starts to increase in pitch, and it will almost disappear completely at 75% onwards. Then the afterburner has that unmistakable sound like a Bunsen burner the size of a car. In Elite there are pulsing sounds in the engine which increase in pitch and amount as you speed up. Even more so when you boost. And pitches down as slow as you slow down. We won't go into weapons until part 2, but they also have their own feedback, not only in their employment, but in locking on, being locked on yourself, hearing them, if they're mechanical, seeing the traces, if they're energy-based weapons and have no aural feedback, all that kind of stuff. Sensory feedback is important in combat, and in space, going that extra bit to help the pilot is everything. Emulating sounds where none should exist helps. I'm not sure where I picked this up from, as it was a long time ago, but it was a book or a film, but it mentioned that some sounds were simply generated to help the pilot with situational awareness, and sounds where none exist in the first place. Now that we've gone through those basics, I'd like to take a closer look at the alpha build the devs have been using, specifically the most recent video of 20th of April where they showed off the DogFight features. Again, massive disclaimer, I know it's alpha, I know it's not final, I know some of these things I'm mentioning are way too hardcore sim, but I believe it's in the benefit of us to talk about it on the forums or from other people making videos, and in hopes to maybe get some things changed. That's what's been going on all along. Everybody's providing feedback, suggestions, and some wild hopes. From here I'll be showing off the footage that was in that video and using some freeze frames, so we'll have a picture here and just go over a couple of things. I'm guessing the idea in this future is to have the HUD clear of things which no longer matter, and in the fiction of space combat even less. What we're presented with is an almost completely head-mounted display. The only HUD and fixed element we see on the Hornet are the speed tape and the Drader's display, direction, range, and distance. This is from Battlestar Galactica, although I'm not sure where they got their name from. At the top of the aircraft windscreen, we see missile inbound, collision warning, hull breach, and G-force alert. For missiles, this is probably a secondary announcer to either both audible warnings of launches or head-mounted display announcers, which seems to be appear vaguely on this screen here. You can see just after a missile there was a red flash in the middle of the screen. You'd expect collision warnings to also pop up regardless of where you're looking, and the rest, so we'll move past these. On the left, moving top to bottom, we have the 3D model of your aircraft. This seems to depict damage states of locations on your ship, but as an assumption it looks a little ambiguous if tiny parts are going to be showing up. Today, with the caution and warning panels, master caution light for letting you know to check things further, or vocal announcements such as
MLWS failure, ECM failure, hydraulics failure.
Below this we have the load factor for latitude, longitude and vertical movement, which is pretty handy actually, and when you reach high Gs it seems to go red. Down again we have the weapon hardpoints with 3D models again, with their full name and the words DMG, PWR, Heat, AI. DMG, I assume it's whether or not it's damaged or not, and will probably change colours depending on how much. PWR, power, seems to go from yellow to orange to red depending on how much power is actually available for the weapons. Heat, or simply how hot the weapon is getting, again changes colour depending on how hot it is. And AI, I assume, again, that's the AI taking over control of weapons. Now, they seem to appear on all the weapons, but I doubt that's the case. It'd probably be something like the ball turret. Then we have some percentages, which seem to show available power or number denoting amount of ammo remaining. It also seems to show unarmed weapons as well, but it's unknown if they are actually equipped or not. I hope some of this is customizable to only show what you have currently selected, and to remove extra information like the 3D models. Talking of customization, since it's all on your HMD and follows your head, it would be cool if we could actually move it to where we wanted to as well, since they are in fixed positions. We've been over the radars partially already. The orange rings at the bottom with a blue circle. That's your globe-like tactical display, showing stuff all around you, relative to you, for quick information. Hopefully it can be zoomed in or out. I've said this before, sizes of icons, decluttered, modes, and prioritized based on threat. Right at the very bottom there seems to be a multiplayer dogfight specific readout. The red and blue bars seem to be score. There are also pop-ups of how much damage done seem to relate to how much those bars go up, so I guess that's just a scoring system for the sakes of, seeing who wins. Top right to top bottom we have a similar 3D model, but of the target selected, showing range in meters and relative velocity, unit names, and a maybe secondary list of alternative targets as well. Around the edges of the screen we can see orange arrows pointing to targets on the list. If they're out of your view, that's what I'm assuming. In the centre directly we have a fixed cross for bore-sighted firing, and for mouse user handy tools where you seem to drag around where you want to turn and how sharply. Targets that aren't locked but are in view of either your own eyes or the ship seem to have a blue circle. Once targeted, have a larger orange circle. It does seem that once your reticle is inside the large orange circle or the interior blue, the guns, if gimbaled, have the ability to track and lead for you. Something I'm a bit wary of if it's made too user-friendly. You need to have some skill aside from point and click, but it's not unimaginable to think that in the future technology is going to be better at us than aiming and leading targets. But for the sake of gameplay, I think they shouldn't go too far with that. Lastly, off centre bottom near the left is the speed tape, and just below that seems to be the thruster setting, but it doesn't seem to be working in the videos right now. So, as of writing this out, I have no idea if elements missing from fighters of today has an effect on space fighters of the future, good or bad. But I'll try figure out in the next episode, Combat, which will talk about everything from planning, heading out on a mission, known and unknown variables, engagements, defending yourself, and going home. And it'll be more action-packed. Oh, and I decided to try out a mock-up of the mix between the Star Citizen Hornet and current heads-up displays. I didn't want to spend too much time on it, but it gives you a better understanding of where I'm going with all this. As I was about to finish part 1, I read the Arena Commander weekly report, which had some interesting pieces, specifically in the section about the HUD, such as warning systems and collisions, and other pieces of information. As well as better readability and new elements, it's something I'm glad they're continuing to put effort into, and while my video might become obsolete at some point, I do think it's great to talk about these things and what could be there and what might be a bit too much. That's it for part 1, see you in part 2.